The forgotten harbors of the Middle Ages, docks, pilings, and the patience of trade. The shape of the shore, the quiet work of harbors. When you think of the Middle Ages, you might imagine castles, knights, or monasteries. Rarely do we think of harbors, those damp, creaking places where ships came to rest, where ropes rubbed raw against wooden posts, and where barrels and bales were stacked in the chill morning air. Yet harbors were among the most vital organs of medieval Europe. Without them, trade could not flow, armies could not sail, and pilgrims could not reach their shrines. In truth, harbors were never glamorous. They smelled of fish, tar, and wet wood. They were filled with mud, shifting tides, and constant repair. But they were essential, and their slow, careful development tells us much about how medieval Europe connected itself to the wider world. Natural and artificial harbors. Unlike the vast engineered ports of modern times, many medieval harbors began as natural inlets. A river mouth, a sandy cove, or a sheltered bay could serve as the first stage of a port. Over time, people adapted these spaces. They hammered wooden piles into the water, creating crude docks. They laid stone quays where goods could be offloaded. Some places remained little more than tidal mudflats, while others grew into bustling centers of commerce. Rivers, especially, were the arteries of trade. A boat could travel inland, carrying wool, timber, salt, or fish. Harbors at river mouths, like those at Bruges or London, became choke points where inland and maritime trade met. The labor of dock workers. Daily life in a harbor was repetitive. Dock workers rose before dawn to unload ships by hand. There were no cranes as we know them. Instead, ropes, pulleys, and sheer human strength moved barrels of wine, sacks of grain, or bundles of wool. The work was muddy, wet, and often dangerous. A slip could send a man into the water between ship and dock. Yet this unending labor kept trade alive. It was not the knights or nobles, but the dock hands, rope makers, shipwrights, and stevedores who made commerce possible. Materials and maintenance. A harbor was never finished. Salt water ate away at wood. Worms burrowed into pilings. Winter storms tore apart quays. Constant maintenance was required. Carpenters replaced beams, masons patched stones, and workers dredged mud from channels. Tar, pitch, and hemp rope were used daily to patch and secure. Even a small harbor consumed enormous amounts of wood. Oak, in particular, was prized for piles and beams. The very forests of Europe were connected to the growth of harbors. Harbors as gateways of control. For rulers, harbors meant more than trade. They meant control. Customs houses arose at the water's edge. Here, officials weighed and taxed goods. Coins changed hands, and records were written into ledgers. Many a kingdom's revenue came not from inland farming alone, but from these damp waterfront exchanges. Kings and lords issued charters to towns with harbors, granting them rights of trade. A village with a decent harbor might grow into a town simply because ships could safely land there. In this way, geography quietly determined wealth. The tide and its discipline. One of the defining features of medieval harbors was their dependence on the tide. Without deep-water docks, most ships had to wait for high tide to enter or leave. Sailors learned to live by the rhythm of the sea, measuring hours by the rise and fall of water rather than by clocks. In tidal harbors, ships often sat in the mud at low tide, their hulls leaning awkwardly against wooden supports. This was normal. Dock workers timed their efforts around the tide's movements, just as farmers obeyed the seasons. The human routine. Imagine standing at a medieval dock just before dawn. A ship has come in during the night. Dock workers gather, rubbing cold hands, waiting for the tide to rise enough for unloading. The air smells of brine and wet rope. The sound is not of grandeur, but of groaning wood, gulls calling, and men's boots squelching in mud. Goods are hauled slowly, stacked onto carts, and rolled into town. Clerks record each shipment. A tax official watches, noting what is due. It is not dramatic. Yet this was the true machinery of medieval commerce, grinding steadily, day after day. Transition point. In this opening section, we have looked at the form and function of medieval harbors. Muddy, creaking places where geography, labor, and tides shaped trade. But this is only the beginning. For harbors were not merely sites of work. They became centers of cultural exchange, of contact with distant lands, and of the spread of both wealth and disease. The pulse of the harbor towns. From muddy shores to market squares. By the 12th and 13th centuries, many medieval harbors had transformed from simple landing places into bustling towns. A dock was no longer just a place to unload sacks of grain. Around it grew warehouses, taverns, shipyards, customs houses, and market stalls. The muddy shore became the nucleus of an entire economy. London's riverbank along the Thames, Bruges' Swin estuary, and Lübeck's harbors on the Baltic are examples. These harbors were not grand, but they drew wealth, and with wealth came people, merchants, clerks, sailors, craftsmen, and innkeepers. The flow of goods. What actually passed through these harbors? The list is long, but each item tells a story of human necessity. Salt, harvested in coastal pans and shipped inland, vital for preserving food. Wool and cloth. England's wool, spun in Flemish towns, became a backbone of Europe's trade. Wine, barrels of Bordeaux, Burgundy, or the Rhineland filled northern ships. Grain, carried from fertile regions to cities that could not feed themselves. Fish, dried cod from the North Sea, salted herring from the Baltic. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, and cloves trickled in from far-off routes. Timber and pitch for shipbuilding and construction. Each sack or barrel was lifted, rolled, and carted by hand. The work was repetitive, but in the repetition lay the slow heartbeat of commerce. Merchants and their ledgers. Merchants became the architects of this trade. They kept ledgers written in cramped script, filled with numbers and names of ships. Some merchants stayed in one place, while others traveled with goods, following routes across the seas. Credit and debt grew around these harbors. A man might sell wool not for coins in hand, but for a note promising payment months later when a ship returned. Thus, finance itself, dull as it may seem, grew from the damp air of the docks, taverns, and the sailor's life. Around every harbor, taverns multiplied. Sailors came ashore with coins to spend, eager for ale, meat, or companionship. Taverns were not only places of relaxation, but also of violence. Brawls between sailors of different nations were common. Yet even here, cultural exchange occurred. Songs, words, and news spread across languages in these smoky rooms. For local townsfolk, sailors were both welcome and feared, bringers of money but also of disorder. Officials often patrolled taverns, attempting to maintain a thin order amid the chaos of harbor nights. Disease at the water's edge. Where goods and people moved, so too did disease. Harbors were the first points of contact for outbreaks. The plague of the 14th century entered many towns through ships. Rats and fleas, hidden in holds, carried devastation inland. Even before the Black Death, lesser outbreaks of fevers, dysentery, and skin diseases were common. Harbor officials sometimes attempted quarantine, keeping ships offshore. Yet enforcement was uneven, and contagion often slipped quietly into the streets. The harbor as a stage of diversity. Harbors were also where cultures met. In Mediterranean ports like Venice, you might see Arab merchants, Byzantine sailors, and European traders shoulder to shoulder. In Northern Europe, Hanseatic merchants brought Baltic goods to English or Flemish docks. For many locals, these harbors were their first glimpse of foreign languages, clothing, and customs. A child growing up near a harbor might hear snatches of Dutch, French, or Italian without leaving their town. The labor behind the scenes. While merchants and sailors filled the stories, it was ordinary laborers who made harbor towns function. Porters, who carried sacks on bent backs. Cask makers, who built barrels for storage. Carpenters and shipwrights, who repaired vessels. Women, who washed clothes, brewed ale, and sold food to passing sailors. All of this labor was invisible to chroniclers, yet it was the backbone of trade. Without it, no harbor could function. A town's identity. In many places, the harbor was not just part of the town, it was the town. To live in Lubeck, Bordeaux, or Bristol was to live by the tide. Market days were timed with ship arrivals. Festivals celebrated safe returns. Taxes and duties funded walls, churches, and bridges. Harbors gave towns identity, prestige, and survival. A bad season of storms could devastate trade. A blocked river mouth could spell ruin. Thus, towns invested in dredging, reinforcing quays, and maintaining the constant war against silt and decay. The slow expansion. Over centuries, these harbors expanded. Stone replaced wood in the most important docks. Warehouses multiplied. Chains of towns linked across coasts. The Hanseatic League, for instance, was nothing more glamorous than a network of harbor towns banding together to regulate trade and secure routes. It was slow, administrative work, charters, tolls, agreements, but it gave Europe its commercial framework. Transition point. We have now seen how harbors became living towns, fed by the labor of many, enriched by trade, yet always vulnerable to storm, silt, or sickness. In the next and final section, we will turn to the enduring legacy of these medieval harbors, how they laid the groundwork for global trade, how they faded or grew into modern ports, and how the rhythms of dock life echo quietly even in our age of container ships. Legacy, decline, and transformation. The fragility of medieval harbors. For all their importance, medieval harbors were fragile. Many were built on shifting riverbanks or exposed coastlines. Without constant maintenance, dredging silt, repairing pilings, reinforcing breakwaters, they could decline rapidly. The estuary at Bruges offers an example. In the 13th century, it was one of Europe's busiest ports, drawing merchants from England, Italy, and the Baltic. Yet over time, the Zwin Channel began to silt. Despite desperate attempts to dredge it, by the 15th century Bruges harbor was largely unusable. Merchants drifted to Antwerp, and Bruges' glory faded. Thus, the fate of a town was tied not only to human ambition, but also to mud, tide, and weather. Political shifts and control. Harbors were also political prizes. Whoever controlled them controlled taxation. Kings, dukes, and city councils fought for customs revenues. Wars were often sparked by disputes over tolls and access. The Hanseatic League, for example, secured privileges in many ports, giving them reduced duties and special trading rights. These agreements made harbors into contested spaces. Local rulers wanted revenue. Foreign merchants demanded freedom. The result was a web of charters, treaties, and occasional blockades. For townspeople, this meant that prices, taxes, and even the availability of goods could shift with distant political decisions. Decline and transformation. Not all harbors declined through silt. Some were eclipsed by new technology. The age of exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries shifted the focus of trade. Ocean-going ships demanded deeper waters and broader quays. Small medieval harbors, built for river barges and coastal cogs, were ill-suited for great carracks and galleons. Some towns adapted. Lisbon, Antwerp, and London expanded to meet the new demands. Others stagnated, left behind as global trade routes bypassed them. Continuities in daily life. Even as global horizons widened, the daily routines of harbor workers changed little. Barrels still had to be rolled, ropes tied, and ships caulked. For ordinary laborers, whether in 1200 or 1600, harbor life was the same. Muddy boots, aching backs, the creak of wood, the smell of tar. This continuity is striking. Empires rose and fell, yet the slow work of unloading cargo remained constant. The echo of medieval harbors in modern ports. Today, vast container ports dominate global trade. Cranes lift steel boxes where men once rolled barrels. Yet beneath the machinery, the same logic endures. Goods arrive by sea, are counted, taxed, and distributed inland. The medieval harbor laid the blueprint for this. Customs houses, quay records, and guilds of dock workers evolved into the bureaucracies and unions of modern ports. Towns that thrived in the Middle Ages, like Hamburg, London, and Venice, still stand as maritime centers, their medieval roots hidden beneath modern infrastructure. Cultural memory. Although most medieval harbors have disappeared or transformed, they remain etched in cultural memory. Old docklands, now quiet, still shape the layouts of cities. Place names preserve forgotten functions. Fish Market Quay, Timber Street, Salt Wharf. In some towns, remnants of pilings are visible at low tide, the skeletons of forgotten trade. In others, warehouses have become museums, preserving the echo of centuries when the world's goods passed through narrow, muddy quays. Reflection. When you think of medieval Europe, perhaps you imagine castles, knights, or monasteries. Yet it was the harbors, humble, muddy, repetitive, that quietly carried the continent forward. Without them, food would not have traveled, ideas would not have spread, and towns would not have grown. Their importance was not dramatic. There were no grand battles fought at the water's edge, no famous kings unloading barrels. Instead, there was the monotony of rope and crate, the rhythm of tide and toil. And yet, this monotony was the very fabric of survival. Closing thought. As you picture the worn quays of Bruges, the wooden pilings of Lübeck, or the muddy banks of Bristol, you may wonder, if such ordinary places built the framework of global trade, what other quiet corners of history still shape our lives today, unnoticed beneath the surface?